I wasn't expecting anyone to be home that night. The house was quiet, dimly lit by the warm glow of a few scattered lamps, and the rain outside pattered softly against the windows. I had poured myself a glass of wine, something rich and red, and settled into the solitude of my room, a rare indulgence these days. Loneliness has a way of creeping in when you least expect it, doesn't it? My husband, Richard, was away on another one of his business trips, something I'd long since grown used to. But this time, I wasn't just lonely, I felt restless, on edge in a way I couldn't quite name. It was an ache that no amount of self-control could quiet. So, I made a choice. A private one. Something to fill the void, even if only for a little while. I had just begun when I heard the faintest noise outside my door. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the old frame, or perhaps the house settling, as it often did. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. My stepson Ethan had mentioned going out with friends earlier. There was no reason to think he'd come back so soon. And yet, I froze when I heard his voice, soft but close. "Margot, are you okay in there?" Panic swept over me. The room was dark except for the faint flicker of the TV screen. I fumbled with the remote, trying to switch it off, but my hands betrayed me, trembling with urgency. The sound, the unmistakable damning sound, echoed louder than ever. "Margot?" His voice came again, closer this time. Before I could find the words to send him away, the door creaked open. I hadn't locked it. There he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of us moved, caught in a web of shock and embarrassment. I don't know what I expected him to do. Turn away, laugh, maybe even say something cutting. But what I saw in his expression was something else entirely. Curiosity. I thought something was wrong, he stammered, his gaze flickering between me and the screen before darting away. "It's not." My voice faltered. "It's not what it looks like." Except it was. My face burned as I scrambled for an excuse, but the words didn't come. The tension in the room was suffocating, like a fragile thread pulled taut and ready to snap. Finally, he cleared his throat and muttered, I should go." But he didn't. Instead, he lingered for just a moment longer, as though he couldn't bring himself to look away. And in that instant, something shifted. It wasn't just the embarrassment or the awkwardness, it was the unspoken understanding that neither of us would forget what had just happened. When the door finally closed and I was alone again, I sat there in silence, the wine glass still clutched in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear but from something deeper, something I didn't want to name. That night, I told myself it was just a mistake. A fluke. But deep down, I knew better. Some lines, once crossed, can never be redrawn. And this was only the beginning. When Ethan moved back home, I expected the same reserved, distant boy I had met years ago when Richard and I married. But at 25, he wasn't a boy anymore. He had a quiet confidence about him now, an easy charm that I hadn't noticed before. He'd grown into himself, and though I told myself it was inappropriate to notice such things, I couldn't help but feel a pang of awareness whenever he was around. That awareness gnawed at me after our first encounter. It wasn't just the embarrassment of him catching me in such a vulnerable moment, it was the look in his eyes, the curiosity, the way he hesitated, as though something about what he'd seen intrigued him as much as it mortified him. I avoided him for the next few days, retreating into the kitchen when I heard his footsteps or pretending to be busy in the garden. But Ethan, it seemed, was determined to bridge the awkwardness. One evening, he knocked on the kitchen door as I was washing dishes. "Hey," he said, leaning casually against the frame. "I didn't mean to scare you the other night." I kept my eyes fixed on the suds, the warm water a welcome distraction. "It's fine. I should have locked the door." "You don't have to explain," he said quickly. Everyone deserves their privacy." There was a beat of silence before he added, "But you seemed upset. Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. It had been years since someone had asked me that, really asked, as though they cared about the answer. Richard was often too preoccupied with work, and I'd long since learned to bury my feelings under the veneer of a perfect wife. "I'm fine," I said too quickly. Then, softening, I added, "Thank you for asking." He nodded but didn't move. His presence filled the small kitchen, and I felt the air between us shift, charged with something unspoken. The tension didn't break. It lingered, wrapping around us in subtle, insidious ways. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I fell into a strange rhythm. He was attentive in ways Richard had never been. He'd offer to help me with small tasks, bringing in groceries, fixing a leaky faucet, or even just sitting with me on the porch as the sun set. One evening, as we shared a bottle of wine on the back deck, he surprised me with a question. "Do you ever get lonely, Margot?" I paused, the glass halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Richard's gone a lot, and it seems like you don't have many people to talk to." His words struck a nerve I didn't know I had. "That's not true," I said, more defensively than I intended. Ethan shrugged, his gaze steady. "I'm just saying, I'm here if you ever need someone to talk to, or not talk to, whatever you need." There was something disarming about his honesty. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. It happened again late one night. I had gone downstairs to fetch a glass of water, only to find Ethan sitting in the living room, illuminated by the glow of the TV. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening when he saw me. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. "You? Not really? Want to join me?" I hesitated but finally sank into the chair across from him. The silence between us was comfortable at first, but then he turned off the TV and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "About the other night," he began, his voice low. I tensed. "Ethan, we don't need to talk about that." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I can't stop thinking about it." My breath caught. "Ethan." He stood then, crossing the room to sit on the edge of the coffee table, inches from me. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think you feel it too." The weight of his words hung between us, undeniable and terrifying. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth betrayed me. I couldn't deny it anymore. That night was the first time we crossed the line. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't logical, but it was inevitable. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises. We told ourselves it was just a fling, something fleeting to fill the emptiness, but the more time we spent together, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't something deeper. Ethan was intoxicating in a way I hadn't experienced in years. He made me feel seen, alive, and desired, but with every secret touch and lingering glance, the risk grew. Richard was due home in a few weeks, and though we were careful, the strain of secrecy began to wear on both of us. One afternoon, as we were returning from a discreet outing to a nearby park, we were caught off guard by an unexpected visitor, Naomi, Ethan's ex-girlfriend. She stood on the front porch, her arms crossed and a sly smile playing on her lips. "Ethan," she drawled. "Long time no see." Her eyes flicked to me, lingering just a second too long. I felt an uneasy chill creep down my spine. "Naomi," Ethan said, his tone carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, just thought I'd stop by," she said sweetly, though her expression betrayed her ulterior motives. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately." As she spoke, her gaze shifted between us, and I knew. Somehow, she knew. This marked the beginning of our unraveling. Naomi's presence was a threat neither of us had anticipated, and her cunning was sharper than either of us realized. She had a knack for prying into things that didn't concern her, and it wasn't long before she started asking questions neither Ethan nor I wanted to answer. As the stakes rose, so did the tension. And while I tried to maintain the facade of a normal life, the cracks were beginning to show. Naomi's reappearance had thrown everything off balance. She claimed her visit was spontaneous, but I could feel the calculation behind every word she spoke, every glance she cast my way. Her eyes lingered just a second too long on Ethan when she thought I wasn't looking, her smile carrying an edge that felt more like a warning. But Ethan and I tried to carry on as if she didn't unsettle us. We told ourselves she was just a distraction, a relic from his past that had no bearing on the connection we were building. Still, her arrival gnawed at me. A week later, Richard called to tell me his business trip was being extended. His voice was distant, more focused on the work he had to manage than the woman waiting for him at home. "I'll be back in 2 more weeks. Maybe 3, he said, almost as an afterthought. I told him to take care of himself, my tone calm and measured. Inside, I felt a pang of guilt and relief. That night, a storm rolled in. The rain came in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof and windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the power flickered once before going out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and tried to settle with a book, but my nerves were on edge. When I heard Ethan's voice calling from downstairs, I was almost glad for the distraction. "Margot? You okay up there?" "I'm fine," I called back, just trying not to trip over anything. A moment later, his flashlight beam lit the staircase as he climbed up to join me. "The power company said it might be a few hours. Mind if I hang out up here?" I hesitated. "Sure, if you don't mind the candles, that is," he grinned. "Better than sitting alone in the dark." We ended up sitting on the living room floor, sharing a blanket as the storm raged outside. Ethan had brought a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen, and the two of us passed it back and forth, letting its warmth take the edge off the chill. "Do you ever wonder what you'd be doing if you weren't here?" he asked suddenly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If you hadn't married Richard. If you weren't stuck in this house all the time." The question startled me. "I'm not stuck," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you?" "He's never here. You don't seem happy." I don't know. I think you deserve more than this." My heart twisted at his words. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I was perfectly content. But as I opened my mouth, the truth came tumbling out instead. "I don't know what I'd be doing," I admitted. "Sometimes I think about it, what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. But it doesn't matter now, does it? This is my life." Ethan leaned closer, his expression soft but intense. "It doesn't have to be." The air between us was heavy, charged with the same tension that had been simmering for weeks. I should have stopped it. I should have walked away, but instead, I let myself be drawn in. When his hand brushed against mine, I didn't pull back. In the days that followed, our stolen moments became more daring. Ethan and I found excuses to leave the house together. A trip to the farmer's market here, a hike on a secluded trail there. It wasn't just about the thrill of being together. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. It was the way he listened when I spoke, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, we ended up at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The place was nearly empty, and we sat in a booth tucked away in the corner, our knees brushing beneath the table. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," I said, stirring my coffee absently. Ethan tilted his head, studying me. "Why do you say that?" "Because this isn't who I am," I said quietly. "I'm not the kind of person who does this." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Maybe you are. Maybe you just didn't know it until now." I wanted to believe him. Naomi wasn't done with us. Ethan had told her we were just family, that there was nothing going on between us. But she didn't buy it. One evening, as I was returning from the grocery store, I found her car parked outside the house. I walked in to find her in the living room with Ethan, her voice raised in accusation. "You're lying to me," she said. "I can see it all over your face." "Naomi, you're being ridiculous," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. Her gaze snapped to me as I entered. "You're part of this, aren't you? What's going on between you two?" I forced myself to stay calm. "Naomi, this isn't appropriate." "Oh, I think it's very appropriate," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think I don't know what's going on? I've seen the way you look at each other. Do you really think you can keep this a secret?" My heart pounded, but I refused to let her see me falter. "You're mistaken," I said evenly. "And I think it's time for you to leave." Naomi's smile was sharp and cold. "Oh, I'll leave. But this isn't over." Ethan and I sat in silence after she left, the tension in the room almost unbearable. "She knows," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't have proof," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "It doesn't matter," I said. "She's not going to let this go." Ethan reached for my hand. "We'll figure it out, together." His words were comforting, but the weight of guilt was growing heavier by the day. Every time I saw Richard's face on a video call, every time I thought about the life I was risking, it became harder to justify what we were doing. And yet, I couldn't stop. Naomi's threat lingered over us like a storm cloud. She didn't have proof, but her sharp instincts and boldness made her dangerous. And Ethan, dear sweet Ethan, believed that ignoring her would make her go away. "It's just talk," he assured me one evening, His arm draped over the back of the couch as we sat close together. "It's not just talk," I snapped, pushing away from him. "You didn't see her face when she left. She knows, Ethan. She's looking for a way to destroy us." "And what do you want me to do? Pay her off?" His frustration flared, but it fizzled as quickly as it rose. "I'll handle her, Margot. I promise." But I wasn't convinced. Naomi wasn't the type to be handled. Before Ethan had a chance to act on his promise, Richard came home early, 3 days ahead of schedule. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door creak open, followed by his heavy footsteps. My stomach dropped. Ethan was upstairs, and while there was nothing incriminating in the house, the sheer proximity of the two men made my pulse race. "Margot?" Richard called, his voice rough from travel. "In here." I forced my tone to sound cheerful, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I turned to greet him. He stepped into the kitchen, setting his suitcase by the door. His face looked more tired than usual, the lines around his mouth deeper. He kissed my cheek, a perfunctory gesture that lacked any warmth. "You didn't tell me you were coming back early," I said. "Got through the meetings faster than I expected." His eyes scanned the room. "Is Ethan around?" The question caught me off guard. Richard had never shown much interest in Ethan's comings and goings before. "He's upstairs, I think," I said carefully. Richard grunted and poured himself a glass of water. "I saw Naomi's car parked out front the other day when I called to check in. What's that about?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "I didn't see her. Maybe she stopped by to talk to Ethan." Richard nodded but didn't press further. Still, his mention of Naomi left a sour taste in my mouth. It didn't take long for Naomi to reappear. One evening, while Richard was out running errands, I found her waiting on the front porch when I came home from a walk. Her arms were crossed, her eyes glinting with malice. "We need to talk," she said. I considered ignoring her, but the determination in her stance told me she wouldn't leave without a confrontation. "What do you want, Naomi?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. She smirked. "Straight to the point. I like that." "Get to it," I said. "I want Ethan." Her words were sharp and unapologetic. "And I think you know that. Whatever, this is between the two of you, it's not going to last. So why don't you step aside and let him come back to me?" I laughed bitterly. "Ethan's a grown man, he can make his own decisions." Her smile widened. "Of course he can. But how do you think Richard would feel if he knew about your little arrangement? Or the rest of the world, for that matter?" My throat tightened. "You wouldn't." "Try me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "All it takes is one little text. A picture here, a message there, and your perfect little life comes crashing down." That night I told Ethan everything. "We have to stop her," I said. "If she tells Richard, it's over. For both of us." Ethan nodded, his jaw set. "I'll talk to her. I'll make her understand." But when he returned from their meeting the next day, his face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. "She's not backing down," he said. "She wants money, a lot of it." My stomach turned. "How much?" 50,000, he said. "She says it's for her silence." "We can't give her that," I said, pacing the room. "She'll just come back for more." Ethan stood abruptly, his frustration boiling over. "Then what do you suggest, Margot? Because I'm out of ideas." I didn't have an answer. Desperate, I turned to my closest friend, Claire. She'd always been sharp and resourceful, and though I hated the idea of dragging her into this mess, I didn't see another option. When I told her the truth, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Margot," she said slowly, "do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" "I didn't plan for this to happen," I said, tears welling in my eyes. It happened." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Okay. Let's think this through. Naomi's a problem, but she's not invincible. There has to be something we can use against her." It turned out there was. Claire dug into Naomi's past, uncovering a trail of unpaid debts and a recent brush with the law. Armed with this information, we devised a plan to force Naomi's hand. The confrontation took place in a neutral location, a coffee shop on the edge of town. Claire and I waited at a corner table, the tension between us palpable. When Naomi arrived, she looked confident, almost smug. "I'm flattered," she said as she slid into the seat across from us. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to face me." "We're done playing your game," Claire said, sliding a folder across the table. Naomi opened it, her expression faltering as she took in the contents. Where did you get this? She demanded. That's not important, Claire said coolly. What is important is that we know who you really are. And if you keep pushing, we won't hesitate to make this public. Naomi's composure cracked, but she recovered quickly. You think this scares me? I have nothing to lose. Maybe, I said. But Ethan does, and so do I. So here's the deal. You walk away and we won't come after you. But if you so much as breathe a word to Richard or anyone else, we'll make sure everyone knows the truth about you. For a moment, I thought she might call our bluff, but then she stood, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. You'll regret this, she said before storming out. Naomi's departure should have been a relief, but it left behind a trail of destruction. Ethan and I were more careful than ever, but the weight of what we'd done was impossible to ignore. Richard began to notice the tension, his gaze lingering on me longer than usual. Is something going on? He asked one evening as we sat in the living room. No, I said quickly. Why do you ask? He shrugged. You've been distant lately, and Ethan seems different too. I just hope everything's okay. The guilt was suffocating. For a few days after Naomi left town, things seemed calm. Ethan and I kept our distance while Richard was home, speaking only when necessary, careful not to let our closeness betray us. But the unease lingered. The cracks were showing. One evening, Richard asked me to join him for dinner at a new restaurant in town. A rare occurrence given his usual workaholic tendencies. I agreed, though I wasn't sure if I was more anxious about leaving Ethan alone or about spending hours pretending everything was fine with Richard. I've been feeling like we've grown apart, Richard said over appetizers, his tone cautious. I froze, the glass of wine halfway to my lips. What makes you say that? He hesitated, swirling his drink. I don't know. Maybe it's the stress from work, but it feels like you're somewhere else lately, like your heart's not in it anymore. Guilt washed over me, but I forced myself to smile. You've been busy, Richard. Maybe we just need to make more time for each other. He nodded, though his expression didn't lighten. The reprieve was short-lived. 2 days later, a package arrived in the mail, addressed to Richard. I found it on the kitchen counter when I came home from running errands. The sight of Naomi's handwriting on the envelope set my heart plummeting. I tore it open, my hands trembling. Inside was a USB drive and a note. Thought you'd like to see what your wife and son have been up to. The implications were clear. Panic surged through me as I shoved the note and USB into my pocket. If Richard had seen it first, I couldn't let myself think about what might have happened. I called Claire immediately. She's still playing games, I said, pacing the living room. I thought we scared her off, Claire said, her voice sharp with frustration. So did I. Do you think Richard saw it? No. I got to it first. Claire was silent for a moment before she said, You need to destroy it. Whatever's on that drive can't exist. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I locked myself in the study and plugged the USB into Richard's computer. My hands shook as I clicked through the files. Photos, videos, nothing explicit but enough to suggest what had been happening, enough to ruin everything if Richard ever saw them. I deleted the files and crushed the USB under my heel, but the damage was already done. Naomi wasn't going to stop until she had destroyed us. The next morning I confronted Ethan. She's still coming after us, I said. His expression darkened. I'll handle it. No, I said firmly. We need to end this for good. Ethan looked at me, his jaw tight. And how do we do that? I don't know yet, I admitted. But we can't keep waiting for her to strike. Claire came through again, digging deeper into Naomi's life. She uncovered something I hadn't expected. Naomi had been fired from her last job for embezzlement. Armed with this new information, I devised a risky plan. Ethan and I arranged to meet Naomi at a motel on the edge of town, far from prying eyes. She arrived late, her expression smug as she sauntered into the room. Miss me? She said, dropping her purse onto the bed. We're done playing games, I said, standing my ground. Her smirk faltered. Oh, are you? That's cute. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and steady. We know about the money you stole from your last job. We know everything. Naomi's confidence wavered, but she recovered quickly. So what? You think anyone's going to believe you? You're the ones with something to lose, not me. I pulled out a folder of documents Claire had gathered, bank statements, emails, and a signed complaint from Naomi's former employer. Her eyes narrowed as she snatched the folder from my hands. This is blackmail, she hissed. It's leverage, I corrected. You leave us alone, and this stays between us. But if you try anything else, this goes to the police. For the first time, Naomi looked genuinely shaken. She threw the folder onto the bed and stormed out without another word. The relief was short-lived. A week later, Richard confronted me in the kitchen. Something's not right, he said, his tone cold and accusing. What are you talking about? I asked, feigning ignorance. You and Ethan, he said bluntly. I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him. My blood ran cold. Richard, that's ridiculous. Is it? He snapped. Because I don't think it is. I think there's something going on, and I want the truth. I felt the walls closing in around me. There's nothing to tell, I said quietly. But Richard didn't believe me. Richard's accusation lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. His eyes bore into mine, searching for a crack in my defense. There's nothing going on, I said again, forcing my voice to remain steady. He's your son. How can you even think that? He didn't blink. I know what I see, Margot. Don't insult my intelligence. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I felt my composure slipping. Richard, I said, trying to redirect, if there's something bothering you, let's talk about it. But throwing baseless accusations around. Baseless. His voice rose, cutting me off. Then why is Naomi saying otherwise? My stomach dropped. Naomi? He nodded sharply. She called me, told me some things I didn't want to believe, said she had proof. I told her to stay out of our lives, but now I'm starting to wonder if she wasn't lying. My mind raced, trying to piece together how Naomi could have gotten to him. She had no proof anymore. At least, not of anything conclusive. Naomi's bitter, Richard, I said carefully. She's angry that Ethan moved on from her. She's trying to cause trouble. And you're saying there's nothing to her story? I held his gaze. Nothing. For a moment, I thought he might believe me, but then he turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, Ethan came to my room. His face was pale, his movements tense. What's going on? He asked as he closed the door behind him. Richard knows something, I said, my voice trembling. Naomi must have gotten to him before we stopped her. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clenched into fists. What do we do? I don't know, I admitted. But if he finds out the truth? He won't, Ethan said firmly. We won't let him. But I could see the fear in his eyes, mirroring my own. The next evening, Richard insisted we have dinner together as a family. It was rare for him to make such a request, and the forced civility of it set my nerves on edge. The three of us sat at the dining table, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound for long stretches of time. So, Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. How's the job search going, Ethan? Ethan looked up, caught off guard. It's fine. I've been looking at a few opportunities. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. I was starting to wonder if you planned on staying here indefinitely. The comment was pointed, and Ethan stiffened. It's not like I'm in your way, he said quietly. Richard's gaze flicked to me, then back to Ethan. No, but I think it's time you moved on, don't you? I opened my mouth to intervene, but Richard held up a hand. I think we've all gotten a little too comfortable with this arrangement. It's not healthy. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. If you've got something to say, just say it. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. Fine, I think it's time for some honesty from both of you. My heart pounded as Richard's eyes locked onto mine. Margot? The room seemed to shrink around me as I tried to find the words to diffuse the situation. But before I could speak, Ethan stepped forward. There's nothing to say, he said, his voice firm. Naomi's lying. She's trying to mess with us because I broke things off with her. Richard's eyes narrowed. And why would she involve Margot in her lies? She's desperate, Ethan said. She'll do anything to get back at me, and dragging Margot into it was just the easiest way to hurt me. Richard's gaze didn't waver. And you expect me to believe that? Yes, Ethan said, because it's the truth. For a moment the room was silent. Then Richard stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Maybe it is, he said finally, but I'm not convinced. And until I am, I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay, Ethan. What? I blurted out, unable to stop myself. Richard turned to me, his expression hard. If there's really nothing going on, this shouldn't be a problem. Should it? Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with an unspoken question. I wanted to tell him to stay, to fight this together, but I knew it would only make things worse. "It's fine," Ethan said quietly. "I'll go." The house felt emptier without him. Richard seemed satisfied with Ethan's absence, though his suspicion toward me hadn't entirely dissipated. I called Ethan every day, though our conversations were brief and strained. He had rented a small apartment on the other side of town and was trying to focus on work, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. "I hate this," he said one night. "Being away from you, letting him win." "It's temporary," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. But the distance was taking its toll. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Naomi made her final move. One afternoon, while I was out running errands, she showed up at Richard's office. She didn't have proof, but she had just enough of the story to sow doubt in his mind. When I returned home, Richard was waiting for me in the living room. "Sit down," he said, his tone icy. I obeyed, my hands trembling in my lap. "Naomi came to see me," he said. "She told me everything, or at least enough to make me question what you've been telling me." "Richard, she's lying," I said quickly. "Is she?" he snapped, "because it's starting to feel like everyone's lying to me." The room was silent, for what felt like an eternity. Then he stood and walked to the door. "I'm leaving," he said. "Don't bother calling me until you're ready to tell me the truth." Richard didn't come home that night, or the night after. I tried calling, but he didn't answer. The house felt unbearably quiet, and for the first time I wondered if I'd truly lost everything. Ethan came over a few days later, his concern evident as he stepped through the door. "Are you okay?" he asked, pulling me into a tight embrace. "I don't know," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. He stayed with me that night, and for a moment it felt like things might be okay. But the damage had been done, and I knew our lives would never be the same. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to pack my bags and fly 5,000 miles for a man I'd never met in person. But there I was, sitting in seat 23A, gripping the armrest as the plane descended into Lisbon. My heart pounded harder with every mile closer to the ground. It wasn't just the turbulence that had me on edge, it was him. We met in the most unromantic place possible, Reddit. It started with a casual comment on a thread about travel mishaps. His reply was witty, sharp, and so out of left field that I couldn't help but laugh. I clicked on his profile, expecting the usual internet nonsense, but his posts were different. Thoughtful. Honest. There was something about him that pulled me in. And before I knew it, I was sending him a private message. The conversations that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced in years. We talked about everything. Movies, books, the stupid things we'd both done in our lives. He told me about growing up in Portugal, about the beaches he used to visit as a kid, about how he was studying to become an architect. I told him about my career as a freelance travel writer, about my divorce, about the way I felt like I'd lost something essential about myself along the way. It wasn't long before our messages turned into phone calls. Then video chats. I started to anticipate his texts, the sound of his voice, the way he made me feel seen in a way no one else had in years. He was 24. I was 49. The age gap should have been enough to stop me, but it didn't. He made me feel alive, desired. Like the version of myself I thought I'd lost forever. So, when he half-joked that I should come visit him, I surprised us both by saying yes. The moment the words left my mouth, I started questioning everything. Was I crazy? What if he wasn't who he said he was? What if this was all a mistake? But then I'd think about his voice, the way he'd say my name, and the way he looked at me during our late-night video chats, and all my doubts would vanish. Now, as the plane touched down, my chest tightened with nerves. The reality of what I was doing hit me like a tidal wave. I was in a foreign country, about to meet a man half my age, someone I'd only known through a screen. It felt reckless, impulsive, and entirely out of character for me, but it also felt right. The moment I stepped into the terminal, my phone buzzed with a message. "I'm waiting by the arrivals gate. Can't wait to see you." I took a deep breath, adjusted my carry-on, and walked toward the gate, my heart racing with anticipation. When I finally spotted him, standing there in a simple white shirt and jeans, looking both nervous and impossibly confident. I knew I'd made the right decision. This was going to change everything. I hadn't set out to change my life. In fact, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you I was perfectly fine. My life wasn't exciting, but it was steady, predictable, safe. At 49, I was a freelance travel writer, and while the idea of it sounded glamorous, the reality wasn't. I spent more time editing photos and writing about places I'd been years ago than actually traveling. My adventures had dwindled to short trips to neighboring states to cover generic articles. 10 underrated getaways for couples, or best beaches to visit in fall. I'd been married for 22 years before my divorce 3 years ago. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, no screaming matches, no fiery accusations. We just drifted apart. He wanted someone who could be more present, someone who'd settle into the rhythm of a quiet life. I didn't know what I wanted back then. Only that I didn't feel alive anymore. By the time we signed the papers, I was numb. The first year after the divorce was a haze of wine nights with old friends and awkward dating apps. I learned very quickly that the dating scene for a 40-something woman was brutal. Most of the men my age were either bitterly divorced or looking for someone to fill the role their ex-wives had left behind. None of them made me feel anything except exhausted. So I stopped trying. For a long time I threw myself into work and told myself that was enough. I didn't need anyone to validate me. I didn't need romance or passion or intimacy. I convinced myself that I was fine. And I was, for the most part. Until one night, sitting alone in my quiet apartment with a glass of wine, I stumbled across that Reddit thread. It was late, and I'd been scrolling aimlessly, trying to distract myself from the endless loop of Netflix shows I couldn't bring myself to finish. The thread was about the strangest places people had met their significant others. It was funny, full of stories about bizarre chance encounters and unlikely connections. I'd commented something lighthearted about how I'd given up on finding anything meaningful and was content at living vicariously through others. It wasn't meant to be anything serious. And then he replied. His comment wasn't particularly remarkable, just a witty quip about how his generation was equally terrible at relationships. But there was something about it that made me laugh out loud, something that prompted me to reply. That was how it started. From that one exchange, we ended up in a back and forth that stretched across the thread and then into private messages. His name was Rui. He was 24, the university student living in Lisbon, working part-time while finishing his architecture degree. I didn't think much of it at first. He was just a stranger on the internet, someone to chat with on a quiet night. But the more we talked, the more I found myself drawn to him. Rui had a way of making everything feel lighter, easier. He was sharp and funny, with a confidence that was magnetic but never overbearing. He asked me questions about my life, my work, my travels, and he actually listened to the answers. The messages turned into a nightly ritual. I'd pour a glass of wine, open my lap, and wait for his reply. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, our favorite books, the cities we wanted to visit, the ridiculous things we'd done in our younger years. He told me about growing up in Lisbon, about his love for the sea and the narrow cobblestone streets of his childhood neighborhood. Somewhere along the way, our conversations shifted. They became more personal, more intimate. He started calling me beautiful, telling me how much he admired my courage for starting over after my divorce. I found myself sharing things I hadn't told anyone in years. How lonely I sometimes felt, how I missed the version of myself who wasn't afraid to take risks. One night, after a particularly deep conversation, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." I laughed it off, told him he didn't know me well enough to say that. But his words stayed with me. As the weeks turned into months, I realized I was looking forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day. I'd wake up thinking about him, wondering what he was doing, what he'd say next. And then, one night, he brought it up. "You should come to Lisbon," he said, half joking. "I'll show you the city, take you to the best spots. You'd love it here." I laughed, brushing it off at first. But the idea planted itself in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more it intrigued me. Why not? I'd spent the last 3 years playing it safe, staying in my bubble, convincing myself that the life I had was enough. But it wasn't. Not really. Rui made me feel things I hadn't felt in years: excitement, desire, the thrill of stepping into the unknown. So, one night, after too much wine and too much thinking, I booked the ticket. The next morning, when I told Rui, he was stunned. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. "I guess I am," I said, laughing. But even as I said it, the weight of what I was doing hit me. What if he wasn't who he said he was? What if this was all a huge mistake? But something deep inside me knew it wasn't. I'd spent too long ignoring my instincts, playing it safe. This was my chance to do something for me, to reclaim the part of myself I thought I'd lost. The weeks leading up to the trip were a blur of anticipation and nerves. Rui sent me lists of places he wanted to take me: cafes, museums, hidden beaches only locals knew about. I found myself daydreaming about what it would be like to see him in person, to walk through the streets of Lisbon with him by my side. By the time the plane took off, I was equal parts terrified and exhilarated. I didn't know what I was walking into, but for the first time in years, I felt alive. When I walked through the arrivals gate at Lisbon Portela Airport, my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I scanned the sea of faces trying to spot him. What if I didn't recognize him? What if he didn't show up? 1,000 doubts raced through my mind as I clutched the handle of my carry-on like it was a lifeline. And then I saw him. Rui was leaning against a column just beyond the crowd, holding a small sign that read, "Welcome, beautiful," in neat black letters. He was taller than I'd imagined, his dark hair slightly messy, his jeans and white shirt casual but effortlessly put together. When our eyes met, he grinned, a wide, easy smile that instantly put me at ease. He waved, and before I knew it, my feet were carrying me toward him. "Claire," he said as I approached, his voice just as warm and familiar in person as it had been over the phone. "Rui," I replied, my own smile breaking through the wall of nerves. We stood there for a moment, both of us a little shy, unsure of how to bridge the gap between months of online intimacy and the reality of being face to face. Finally, he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. His arms were strong and steady, and I felt myself relax against him, the tension in my shoulders melting away. "You're really here," he murmured, pulling back just enough to look at me. "I guess I am," I said, laughing softly. The walk to his car was filled with easy conversation, the kind of effortless back and forth that had always been the foundation of our connection. He asked about my flight, I teased him about the sign, and by the time we reached his car, the initial awkwardness had faded. The drive into the city was a sensory overload. Lisbon was nothing like the quiet suburban neighborhoods I'd grown used to. The streets were alive with color and movement, brightly painted buildings, bustling cafes, the occasional tram rattling by. Rui pointed out landmarks as we drove, his enthusiasm contagious. "That's the Elevador de Santa Justa," he said, nodding toward a striking iron lift. "We'll go there later. It's got one of the best views of the city." I listened, soaking in every word, every sight, but I was also hyper-aware of him. The way his hands gripped the steering wheel, the way his voice shifted slightly when he spoke in English. He was even more attractive in person, his presence magnetic in a way that left me feeling giddy and off balance. When we arrived at his apartment, a cozy flat in a charming older building, he helped me carry my bag inside. The space was small but inviting. Whitewashed walls, a worn leather couch, books stacked haphazardly on every available surface. "It's not much, but it's home," he said, scratching the back of his neck, suddenly looking a little bashful. "It's perfect," I replied, meaning it. We spent the afternoon walking through the city. Rui took me to a small cafe tucked away in an alley, where we sipped tiny cups of espresso and shared a plate of pastel de nata, the custard tarts he'd raved about in one of our first conversations. The city was as vibrant and alive as I'd imagined, but it was Rui who held my attention. The way he moved through the streets with an easy confidence, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his favorite spots, the way his hand occasionally brushed mine as we walked, it was intoxicating. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I was utterly captivated. "Are you ready for the best view in Lisbon?" Rui asked, his grin mischievous, as he led me up a winding staircase to a rooftop bar overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking. The terracotta rooftops stretched out before us, the Tagus River glittering in the distance, the iconic Ponte 25 de Abril bridge silhouetted against the fading light. "It's beautiful," I said, leaning against the railing. "So are you," Rui replied, his voice softer now. I turned to look at him, my breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was charged, every second stretching out like an eternity. And then he kissed me. It started slow, tentative, like he was testing the waters. His lips were warm and soft, his hand gently cupping my face. I leaned into him, my heart racing as the kiss deepened, years of longing and self-doubt melting away in an instant. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my cheeks flushed. Rui smiled, his forehead resting against mine. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," I admitted, my own voice shaky with emotion. By the time we returned to his apartment, the city had settled into a quiet rhythm, the streets lit by the soft glow of street lamps. Rui opened a bottle of wine, and we sat on the couch, talking and laughing like we'd known each other forever. At some point, the conversation trailed off, replaced by a comfortable silence. He reached for my hand, his fingers brushing mine, and I felt a spark that sent shivers down my spine. "Claire," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. I didn't let him finish. I leaned in, capturing his lips in a kiss that was no longer tentative or shy. It was hungry, filled with the kind of urgency that comes from months of waiting and wanting. The rest of the night unfolded in a blur of heat and sensation. His hands on my skin, his whispered words in my ear, the way he made me feel like the only woman in the world. It was more than I dared to imagine. When it was over, we lay tangled together on his bed, the faint sounds of the city drifting in through the open window. I traced lazy circles on his chest, my mind spinning with a mix of disbelief and contentment. "You're incredible," Rui murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "So are you," I replied, my voice barely audible. In that moment, with his arms wrapped around me and the world outside fading into nothing, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. And I knew this was just the beginning. The first night we spent together in Rui's apartment set the tone for the days that followed, intense, intoxicating, and impossible to forget. I woke up to the soft morning light streaming through the curtains and the warm weight of his arm draped across my waist. For a moment, I stayed perfectly still, afraid to break the spell. It felt surreal, lying there beside him, his slow, steady breathing the only sound in the room. When he stirred, his eyes fluttering open, the lazy smile that spread across his face made my chest tighten. "Bom dia," he murmured, his voice low and rough with sleep. I didn't know any Portuguese, but I didn't need a translator to know what it meant. "Good morning," I whispered back, unable to stop myself from smiling. We stayed in bed longer than we should have, talking, laughing, and stealing kisses between soft stretches of silence. By the time we finally pulled ourselves out from under the covers, the day was already well underway, but neither of us cared. Rui had planned out every detail of my visit, determined to show me his city through his eyes. Each day was a new adventure. We wandered through the cobblestone streets of Alfama, the oldest district in Lisbon, where the narrow alleys seemed to breathe with history. He led me to hidden viewpoints that overlooked the city, the kind of spots only a local would know, and insisted on introducing me to every traditional dish he could think of. It wasn't just the places he took me or the things we did. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered. I'd never felt so seen, so alive. One of the most unforgettable moments happened 3 days into my trip. Rui had taken me to a rooftop bar he'd mentioned on our first night, a place he said was one of his favorites. It wasn't hard to see why. The view was breathtaking, the city spread out beneath us like a living, breathing work of art. We sat at a small table near the edge, sharing a bottle of wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. The conversation flowed easily as it always did, but there was an undercurrent of tension between us, a spark that neither of us could ignore. At one point, I stood to take in the view, leaning against the railing as the city lights began to twinkle in the growing darkness. Rui came up behind me, his hands resting lightly on my hips. "You're beautiful," he said softly, his breath warm against my ear. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. There was something in his eyes that made me forget about the people around us, the waitstaff moving between tables, the distant hum of conversation. All I could think about was him. His touch, his scent, the way his presence consumed me. When he kissed me, it was slow and deliberate, a kiss that made the world fall away. His hands slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I felt a shiver run through me despite the warmth of the night. "Rui," I murmured against his lips, my voice trembling. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes dark with desire. "Come with me," he said, taking my hand. He led me down a narrow staircase to a quiet terrace just below the bar, a secluded spot hidden from view. The air was thick with anticipation as he pressed me against the wall, his lips finding mine again in a kiss that left me breathless. The city stretched out before us, but in that moment, all I could see, all I could feel, was him. Later that week, Rui surprised me with a day trip to Sintra, a small town just outside Lisbon known for its fairy tale castles and lush landscapes. We boarded the train early in the morning, the carriage quiet except for the occasional chatter of other passengers. The ride was peaceful, the scenery outside the window shifting from the bustling city to rolling hills and dense forests. Rui sat beside me, his arm draped casually over the back of my seat, his thumb tracing lazy circles on my shoulder. As the train rocked gently, I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. The intimacy of the moment was almost overwhelming, a quiet reminder of how far I'd come from the safe, predictable life I'd left behind. Halfway through the journey, Rui leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear. "I've been thinking about you all morning," he whispered, his voice low and filled with promise. My breath hitched, a flush rising to my cheeks as I glanced around the carriage. It wasn't crowded, but there were enough people nearby to make his words feel both thrilling and dangerous. "Rui," I said softly, a hint of warning in my tone. He smirked, clearly enjoying my reaction. His hand slid from my shoulder to my thigh, his touch light but purposeful. My pulse quickened as his fingers traced small, teasing patterns against the fabric of my dress. "You're incredible," he murmured, his lips brushing the corner of my mouth. I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his gaze. The tension between us was palpable, an electric current that made it impossible to think clearly. By the time we arrived in Sintra, I was a mess of emotions, my body humming with anticipation. Rui took my hand as we stepped off the train, his smile telling me that he knew exactly what he was doing to me. Our adventures in Sintra led us to a small art gallery tucked away in a quiet corner of the town. It was nearly empty, the only sound the soft echo of our footsteps as we wandered through the dimly lit space. The exhibits were beautiful, but I could hardly focus. Rui stayed close to me, his presence a constant distraction. Every time he brushed against me, every time his hand found the small of my back, I felt my pulse quicken. At one point, we found ourselves alone in a narrow hallway lined with paintings. Rui stepped in front of me, his expression serious as he placed his hands on my hips. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and filled with need. My heart raced as he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that left me breathless. The quiet, almost sacred atmosphere of the gallery made the moment feel even more forbidden, adding to the intensity of what was happening. His hands slid down my sides, his touch sending shivers through me as he pressed me gently against the wall. I knew we were taking a risk, that someone could walk in at any moment, but I didn't care. The rest of the world faded away as I lost myself in him, in the way he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. By the end of the week, Rui and I had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost natural. We spent our days exploring the city, stealing kisses in quiet corners, and sharing meals at tucked-away restaurants. At night, we returned to his apartment, where our connection deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible. Each moment with him was a reminder of what it felt like to be alive, to take risks, to let go of the fears and doubts that had held me back for so long. But as much as I tried to live in the moment, a small part of me couldn't ignore the reality of our situation. My time in Lisbon was limited, and sooner or later I'd have to leave. The thought of saying goodbye was almost unbearable, but I pushed it to the back of my mind, determined to make the most of the time we had left. For now, Rui was mine, and I was his. And that was enough. By the 6th day of my trip, the reality of what was coming hit me like a freight train. The end was closer than I wanted to admit. Each passing moment felt heavier, tinged with the knowledge that our time together had an expiration date. Rui tried to hide it, but I could see the tension creeping into his smile. The way his hands lingered on me a little longer, the way his eyes searched mine during quiet moments. We were both pretending to live in the present, but the future loomed over us, unspoken and inevitable. It all came to a head on the evening of the 6th day. Rui had taken me back to the rooftop bar we'd visited earlier in the week, a place that now felt almost sacred to us. The sun was setting, casting the city in hues of gold and crimson, and the air between us felt charged, not with passion this time, but with something heavier. "You've been quiet all day," Rui said, his voice soft but probing. I looked down at the glass of wine in my hand, swirling the liquid aimlessly. "Just thinking," I replied. "About what?" I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. "About what happens next," I finally admitted. Rui leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Do we have to talk about this now?" "Yes," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "We can't keep pretending like this is going to last forever." "And why can't it?" he shot back, his eyes flashing. "Why do you always assume this has to end the moment you get on that plane?" "Because it does," I said, my voice cracking. "You have your life here, Rui. Your studies, your friends, your future. And I stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I have nothing to offer you. I'm twice your age, Rui. This, whatever this is, it can't last." His face hardened, his usual warmth replaced with frustration. "Stop saying that," he said, his voice low but intense. "You keep talking about our age difference like it's the only thing that matters, but I don't care about that. Why do you?" "Because it's not realistic," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "You deserve someone who can be there for you. Someone who can build a life with you. I can't give you that." "You don't know what I want," he said, his voice rising. "You've decided this for me, like you're protecting me from something I don't need protection from." His words cut deep, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. He was right. I had made assumptions, drawn lines in the sand to keep myself from getting hurt. But the truth was, I was terrified. Terrified of what it would mean to let myself fall for him completely. "I'm scared, Rui," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His expression softened, and he reached across the table to take my hand. "So am I," he said quietly, "but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." We didn't talk much after that. Rui paid the bill, and we walked back to his apartment in silence. But the tension between us had shifted, less like a storm, and more like the calm after it. When we got inside, he turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Come here," he said softly, pulling me into his arms. The kiss that followed wasn't like the others. It wasn't frantic or urgent. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with a kind of tenderness that made my chest ache. "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow," he murmured against my lips. "But I know I don't want to waste tonight." Neither did I. When I woke up the next morning, Rui was already awake, lying beside me with his head propped on one hand. He was watching me, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and soft. "Good morning," I replied, my own smile tentative. For a moment, we just lay there, the quiet between us comfortable but heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying. "I don't regret this," Rui said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, my heart twisting at the vulnerability in his eyes. "Neither do I," I said softly. He reached out to brush a strand of hair from my face, his touch lingering. "Then let's not think about tomorrow. Not yet." That evening, we went for one last walk through the city. Rui took me to a quiet spot by the river, where the lights of the city reflected off the water like shimmering gold. We sat on a bench, the cool breeze brushing against our skin, and for a while we just sat there, lost in our own thoughts. "I don't want this to be goodbye," Rui said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "It doesn't have to be," I replied, though the words felt hollow. We both knew the truth. As much as we wanted to hold on to what we had, reality would catch up with us eventually. He had his life in Lisbon, and I had mine thousands of miles away. Maybe, I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. Maybe it's better if we leave this as it is, a perfect memory. Rui turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. Do you really believe that? I don't know, I admitted, tears stinging my eyes, but I know that I'll never forget this, or you. His hand found mine, his grip firm but gentle. Neither will I. The next morning, Rui drove me to the airport. The car ride was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. When we arrived, he parked and walked me to the terminal, his hand never leaving mine. When it was time to say goodbye, he pulled me into a hug, holding me so tightly I thought I might break. Thank you, I whispered, my voice cracking. For what? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. For reminding me what it feels like to be alive, I said, tears spilling down my cheeks. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away my tears. You'll always have a piece of me, he said softly, and I'll always have a piece of you. Our final kiss was slow and bittersweet, filled with everything we couldn't put into words. When we pulled apart, I turned and walked through security, not daring to look back. Back home, life felt quieter, emptier. I went through the motions, returning to work and settling back into my routine, but everything felt different now. Rui had changed me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. A few weeks later, I received a message from him, a photo of the rooftop bar, the city stretching out in the background. Thinking of you. I stared at the message for a long time, my chest aching with a mix of longing and gratitude. Rui had been a chapter in my life, a fleeting but powerful reminder that I was capable of feeling, of risking, of living. And while our time together had ended, the impact of it never would. When I returned home, everything felt different. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now seemed smaller somehow, quieter, duller. The soft hum of my refrigerator, the way the morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, even the comforting weight of my favorite blanket, all of it felt muted, like a life that didn't quite fit anymore. For the first few days I floated through my routines like a ghost. I unpacked my suitcase, washed my clothes, and opened my laptop to catch up on work. But my mind kept drifting back to Lisbon. To Rui. I found myself replaying those moments over and over, the way his hand had lingered on mine as he showed me the view from the rooftop bar, the sound of his laughter echoing through the narrow streets of Alfama, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world. For the first time in years, I felt the ache of longing, not the quiet, manageable loneliness I'd grown used to after my divorce, but a raw, aching void that made me realize how much Rui had touched a part of me I'd thought was gone forever. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to settle back into my life. I picked up new freelance assignments, diving into articles about destinations I hadn't visited in years. I reconnected with friends, joined a new book club, and even started going on evening walks to clear my mind. But Rui was always there, lingering in the corners of my thoughts. Every time I saw a postcard of a European city, I thought of him. Every time I heard someone speaking Portuguese at a cafe or on the street, my chest tightened. I didn't regret a single moment of our time together, but the weight of missing him was heavier than I'd expected. Then one day, I received a message. It was simple. A photo of the rooftop bar where we'd shared our first kiss, the Lisbon skyline stretching out in the background. Beneath it, Rui had written, "Thinking of you." I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, my heart swelling with a mix of longing and gratitude. I typed out a response. "I miss you." But before I hit send, I hesitated. I closed the app, setting my phone face down on the counter. I wasn't ready to reach out, not yet. Over the next few months, I started to unpack what my time with Rui had meant to me. He had been more than just an escape, more than just a fleeting romance. He had reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That I was still capable of feeling deeply, of taking risks, of stepping outside the safe, predictable bubble I'd built around myself. He'd reminded me of what it felt like to be alive. For years, I'd convinced myself that the kind of passion and connection I'd felt with Rui was reserved for younger people, for those who hadn't yet been worn down by the weight of life's responsibilities and disappointments. But he showed me that it wasn't about age or circumstances. It was about letting yourself be vulnerable, about taking chances, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. I realized that Rui wasn't the answer to everything I'd been missing, but he was the spark that had reignited something inside me. Eventually, I found myself looking at Lisbon flights again. Not to see Rui, not yet, but because the thought of traveling, of exploring the world again, made my heart race in a way it hadn't in years. I booked a trip to Paris, a city I hadn't visited since my 20s, and spent 2 weeks wandering through its streets, rediscovering the thrill of adventure. I wrote about the experience in a new kind of travel article. Not a guide to sights and attractions, but a deeply personal reflection on what it means to find yourself in a new place. It was the first piece of writing in years that felt truly honest, and when it was published, the response was overwhelming. Readers sent me messages about how much the story had resonated with them, how they too had felt lost and had found something, whether in travel, in love, or in themselves, that brought them back to life. Rui had taught me that life didn't have to be small or predictable, that even at 49, I was still capable of new beginnings. I never deleted Rui's message. Every now and then I'd open it, staring at the photo of the rooftop bar and the simple words he'd written. I'd wonder what he was doing, if he'd finished his degree, if he ever thought about me the way I still thought about him. Once I typed out a long message telling him about Paris, about how he'd inspired me to find my sense of adventure again. But I didn't send it. I didn't need to. Rui had been a chapter in my life. A beautiful, transformative chapter that reminded me of what I was capable of. And while that chapter had ended, its impact lingered, shaping the way I moved forward. On the 1-year anniversary of my trip to Lisbon, I found myself sitting in a cafe in Florence, sipping a cappuccino as I watched the city wake up around me. I'd come a long way since that first impulsive decision to fly across the world for a man I'd never met. I still thought about Rui from time to time, but not with sadness or regret. Instead, I thought about the way he'd smiled at me that first night, the way he'd held my hand as we walked through the city, the way he'd whispered my name like it was the most precious thing in the world. He'd given me a gift, a reminder that life is meant to be lived boldly, passionately, and without apology, and for that, I would always be grateful. As I finished my cappuccino and stepped out into the streets of Florence, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. I wasn't the same woman who had boarded that flight to Lisbon a year ago. I was stronger now, braver, more willing to take chances. And in some small, quiet corner of my heart, I knew Rui would always be with me. His memory a constant reminder of the beauty of letting yourself feel deeply, even when it scares you.